Okay, well, thank you, Matt, for the introduction and the invitation to join you all at your conference. It's a pleasure to join you, and it looks like you've really covered a lot of ground already today. So I hope I can just share and complement a lot of the great information with some education from the Organic Trade Association's point of view. So just a little bit more background on myself. I have a background in organic regulations and certification. I work at OTA as the Farm Policy Director. That's on our regulatory team. So anything involving the organic regulations for organic crop and livestock regulations are within my wheelhouse. I also work closely with a number of our member communities, including our Farmers Advisory Council, our Grains Sector Council, and our Produce Council. And then I also head up a few of our technical regulatory task forces. Some of the highlights are residue testing and also inerts in pest control materials. So very, very weedy issues. A little bit more about the Organic Trade Association, if you're not familiar. We are a membership-based business association for organic agriculture and products in the US, and our mission is to promote and protect organic. And our membership represents over 9,000 organic businesses across all 50 states, all sectors, all steps of the supply chain, from organic growers to processors, distributors, importers, exporters, certifiers, retailers, and it goes on. So it's a community really where everyone in the organic value chain can come together. Our priorities are spread across the association. As I said, I work mostly in our regulatory and advocacy side of things, but we do a lot more. We do lots of different education and communications type of services. We do a lot of market and consumer research, some of which I'll be sharing with you today. We also do international market and trade development in concert with the USDA Foreign Ag Service. And then we also have our sister organization, the Organic Center, that does research on the benefits of organic. So for today, I thought what I'd cover with this group is an emphasis on the organic grain sector within a high-level view of the organic market. So we'll touch on US retail, we'll touch on US farm gate, and we'll touch on imports as we talk about the organic market overview. And then we'll go into the policy side of things and really take a look at what's going on at USDA and the organic regulations that are going to impact organic grain sector. And then lastly, I want to touch on some industry priorities that are relevant to supporting the organic grain sector domestically. Okay, and if it's all right, since I'm going to kind of cover a whole landscape of topics, if I can get through the bulk of the presentation, and then during the Q&A, we can touch on any of the different parts, but that'll just let me make sure I get through everything. So let's start with some information on the US retail data. This is all coming from the OTA's Organic Industry Survey, and it's capturing data from 2020. And it goes without saying that 2020 was a year like no other with the pandemic. And the data is showing that the organic industry grew 12.8% in 2020, reaching nearly $62 billion in US sales. So organic has always been a bright spot in the food and farm economy, but this was a staggering growth year. And our reporting goes into some of the details on what might have been driving this huge surge in growth. Due to the pandemic, consumers were really having an increased awareness about health. And the health implications with organic foods really drove consumers to choose organic products more often. Because during a pandemic, people are looking for ways to improve their overall health and wellness. Another driving factor was the shift from food service dollars to grocery store purchases, because as food service venues closed down, consumers ended up shopping more at grocery stores. And most organic products are already being sold through grocery retail. So that shifted dollars, favored existing organic sales channels. and not to mention all of the panic shopping and pantry stocking that went on. It overwhelmingly drove some increased purchases of organic products. Now, there were also some significant supply chain disruptions and challenges that made it difficult for organic businesses to keep up with the demand, processing facilities and transportation issues, getting access to packaging goods, and other issues, keeping workers safe, all things that were major challenges in 2020 and of course are still a challenge today. The $62 billion organic market, to no surprise to anyone, is consisting mostly of food. 90% is food, but it's interesting to know that there is a significant non-food sector within organic. So that's things like cotton and wool for textiles, personal care products, pet food, flowers. These other things are making up $5.5 billion of the organic market. Almost every food category benefited from the purchase behavior shifts that were brought on by the pandemic. Organic fruits and vegetables led the way in sales, accounting for 36% of all food sales. And then categories that didn't fare as well were products that were meant to be consumed on the go, like nutrition bars or food that was meant for food service. So I'm going to go into a little bit more detail on categories that are relevant to organic grain producers. So items in the breads and grains category recorded 12.3% growth, which is the highest sales growth that this category has achieved in over a decade, and it's now the 5th largest organic food category. Because the pandemic brought on a resurgence of home baking and pantry stocking, I think everybody took their turn trying homemade sourdough bread. Sales of organic flour and other baking needs grew at an unprecedented rate of 30%. And people eating at home meant more organic rice and grains sales. So we're seeing that subcategory grow at 18% and then pasta at 23%. In the packaged foods category, pantry staples like canned goods and dry soups and pasta sauces, this is the 4th largest organic food category, and it grew at a rate of over 11%. That's the 2nd highest growth rate that this category has had in the past decade. It was only 3% growth the year before. So we think we're seeing dried prepared foods like boxed macaroni and cheese, for example, growing almost 40% last year, compared to only 8% in the year prior. Another example, frozen prepared meals, which were basically flat growth in 2019, grew at a pace of over 10% in 2020. In the snack foods category, typically the nutrition bars, granola bars, those have been a stalwart organic category, but in 2020, there was not growth because these are items that typically are consumed on the go and consumers are mostly staying at home. In the organic dairy and eggs category, this comprises about 8% of the total organic market. Milk and cream is the 2nd largest organic food subcategory, just behind fresh produce. And 2020 was the largest growth year in a decade for this group of products, which had been in the low single digits before. And so while this category is really large and had a year this good, it really had a measurable effect on the industry as a whole. And grains, of course, used for animal feed really underpin this really important growing category of organic products. And in the organic meat and poultry sector, this is the smallest category of organic food, but it did experience the 2nd highest growth rate, nearly 25%. And this is a sector where the supply chain constraints were particularly apparent, and those limited the processing capacity that constrained product availability. So we're going to zoom out from the market data and go back to the farm and look at some of the production data for a picture on how domestic organic farmers are growing this organic market. So I pulled some relevant data from the 2019 USDA National Ag Statistics Organic Survey. The certified organic farmers on this in this conference likely filled out your survey and contributed to this data. And from this data set, we can look at the market value of certified organic products sold at the farm gate. This data set shows that there's 16,500 organic farms in the US, and that those operations, the number of operations increased 17% since the last time that USDA did this organic survey, which was back in 2016. And that the land used for certified organic production increased almost 10%. In total, the dollar value of certified organic products sold from the farm gate in 2019 was $9.9 billion, and that's 31% higher than the data from 2016. Crops are making up 60% of those sales, and then if you dive down to just field crops, which is the third highest crop sector, behind vegetables first, fruit second, you can see the data for field crops has increased since the 2016 data. A closer look at the field crops, sorry, let me get my slides to advance. The total dollar value of US produced corn, alfalfa hay, wheat, and soy, you can see all increased since 2016 based on the USDA data. And then the last highlight I wanted to share from the NASS data set is about future production. This is a rare opportunity where USDA is collecting data on transitioning acres. And the data shows that over 250,000 acres are currently in transition at certified organic operations, with another 60,000 acres from brand new farms that are seeking organic certification for the first time. And when asked about future production plans, over 3/4 of farms are planning to maintain or increase acreage, and less than 6% are even considering decreasing or discontinuing organic altogether.
Hey, Joe, we had a question come in about the trend within the dairy industry between organic and grass-fed organic and grass-fed non-organic. Is anything to comment on there?
I can comment. I think that I don't know if we have data on this in our industry survey, but from what I've read in studies done on these value-added label claims, grass-fed is a desirable add-on label because it's meeting the consumer desire for more climate-friendly foods and more healthy foods. I'd be happy to dig into our records and see what additional information I can share with you, Matt, for distribution to the audience.
Awesome, thanks very much.
Okay, taking a bit of a global view now, the US organic market remains the largest market globally for organic products. We represent 42% of the $122 billion global organic market, and EU is right there with us as our counterpart in the global organic community. Data on 2022 will be available in February, so we'll be updating this data shortly. Now, in terms of data tracking on imports, because I know this is a very important issue for domestic organic grain producers, is understanding the dynamics and navigating the dynamics with competition from imports. So this is data that we pulled from the USDA Global Organic Database. This is for food grade corn, wheat, soybeans, and soybean meal. And what our records show is that imports are down for each of these commodities in 2020. There may be different dynamics for each one, but we have special considerations for organic soybean meal. This commodity is experiencing significant decline due to two very interesting dynamics with international trade. One of the dynamics is regarding the termination of the US-India organic recognition agreement. So the NOP terminated this agreement that had allowed India's government to accredit certifiers in India to administer the NOP regulations to farms in India that are certified organic under the NOP standards, but the assurance of integrity was not strong enough, so NOP terminated that. And so now we're in this transition period where farms in India need to get directly certified to a USDA accredited certifier. And so this transition has caused some disruption and slowdown of trade. And then also there's an investigation into anti-dumping and countervailing trade of organic soybean meal imports from India. So the International Trade Commission and the Department of Commerce have found preliminary information that soybean meal has been sold at less than fair value, and market harming subsidies are being provided by the Indian government to increase exports to the US. So this is a very, this is an area of focus for us as we track the import dynamics related to organic soybean meal.
And Joe, if I could just
in looking at, yeah, go ahead.
Ask a quick question about that. So is it, once that that market is cut off, so their entire production year, this I guess would be in 2021, is not eligible for importation to the US. Is that right? Or anything they'd have stored up or stocked would not be allowed to just be imported as organic if they went through the certification process?
Do you mean soybean meal or any product certified under the India recognition agreement?
Yeah, I guess soybean meal specifically, but I suppose that would probably just relate to the crops in India in general.
So crops in India in general, the trade may continue because the transition period allows for farms, as long as they have applied to a new certifier by July was the deadline, they can continue to export products to the US under their previous organic certification. The next milestone that's coming up is next July, where the certification needs to be completed and finalized with their new certifier. But because of some of the questions around the procedure, plus the difficulties that COVID has had in India preventing normal business practices, it prevented some otherwise legitimate trade. And then for the soybean meal, I think the ITC and Department of Commerce investigations have just presented a lot of fear in exporting to the US because exporters might have felt they would be subject to some penalties. And so anyone in the US relying on imported organic soybean meal for feed has likely seen some very extreme price increases because of these difficult trade dynamics. And at OTA, we have an international trade staff person who's tracking this. And so I'm more than happy to connect any concerned producers with the resources that we can make available.
Yeah, thanks for answering the question. That's helpful.
Yeah, we actually had the ITC give a briefing to our members on this topic. I believe we have that briefing recorded, and so we'll see what we can make available from that. Great, and then looking at how much of an opportunity this might present for domestic organic producers to make up this gap and reduce reliance on imports. The Mercaris data shows that only 1% of US organic acreage is organic. And then the OTA market data shows that 6% of food sales are organic. So there is a big gap and an opportunity for domestic production to make up that difference. And in terms of some of the more common grains coming in through imports, the Mercaris data shows that 75% of US organic soybeans are imported, 25% of organic corn, and around 7% of organic wheat. And that the demand is mainly driven for the demand for livestock feed. One of the larger segments there is the growth in dairy. So that's from a Mercaris report. So that wraps the market information segment of my presentation, but I will have some resources at the end of my presentation that you can go to get more information on market data. So shifting into what's going on at the USDA and policy, we have new leadership at USDA, new leadership, but a familiar face with Secretary Vilsack back as Secretary of Agriculture. And it's clear that organic is a priority, and organic is also a key to several other USDA priorities, like revitalizing rural economies, advancing climate smart agriculture, supporting supply chain resiliency, ensuring an equitable food system. So organic really is a focal point of a lot of the things that USDA wants to achieve. Also, other new leadership positions that have been appointed also elevate organic. So the newly appointed Undersecretary of Marketing and Regulatory Programs, this is the position that oversees the National Organic Program. So the person that was just appointed for that position is Jenny Lester-Moffitt, who has decades of organic experience, starting from managing her family's own organic walnut farm in California. And then the other great news is that the position of Organic Policy Advisor is a role that had been established in previous administrations, but was eliminated during the most recent administration, is now restored. So we have a senior position in the Secretary's office that's responsible for integrating organic into all parts of the activities across all USDA agencies. And the person in that position is Marnie Carlin, and she has decades of experience in organic, knows organic, and values organic. So we're in a good position to see organic get a lot of support during this administration. And I want to highlight one of the initiatives that USDA is doing that directly supports organic transition. There's new funding available to supplement certification cost share, and it includes special provisions for transitioning producers. And the application period is open now through January 7th, and you can get a portion of your expenses reimbursed that you've paid for certification fees, and then also any pre-certification inspections and organic system plan development that a transitioning operation might have gotten from either a certifier or a consultant can get reimbursed. You can also be reimbursed for educational event registrations and also any expenses for soil testing. So keep an eye on that if you've got those fees and would like those reimbursements. Then there's this big pool of funding, $200 million that the USDA is planning to invest in supporting organic transition. They plan to make transformative investments into technical assistance for organic and transitioning farms, investments into processing and distribution infrastructure to expand organic markets, and training USDA field staff so that there's more awareness and expertise in organic programs and practices at FSA offices. They're also looking to make policy updates to conservation, cost share, crop insurance, and research programs. So this initial program is meant to be a pilot type of program where some initial investments and policy tweaks can be made. And then we're looking to integrate and formalize these programs into the next Farm Bill so that the outcomes can be lasting beyond this initial pool of funding. The largest rulemaking priority for the USDA is the strengthening organic enforcement rule. This is the rule that is meant to address organic fraud, both domestic and abroad. The rule is going to close gaps in the regulations and build more consistent certification practices to deter fraud. We know that the organic industry has grown so much since the organic regulations were first implemented, and with the increasingly global and complex supply chains and the organic price premiums, those dynamics create the opportunity for fraud. And unfortunately, we have seen major acts of organic fraud. And so this regulation is meant to close the gaps in the regulations that allowed for fraud to happen, with a focus on uncertified handlers that had created gaps in the organic supply chain and creating those gaps in the chain of custody that were taken advantage of by fraudsters. So where are we at in this process of rulemaking? It started with a congressional mandate in the 2018 Farm Bill. So this was just on the heels of the fraud cases from the Black Sea region and from the Midwest. There was a congressional mandate for the USDA to issue new regulations that would strengthen enforcement. Last summer was the proposed regulation, the very large regulation. It was open for a 60-day comment period. The final rule is expected to be published in the spring, and we will be tracking that very closely, and then ultimately the implementation will occur over the course of the following year, so that current operations have enough time to come into compliance with the new provisions. So I will highlight some of the major provisions of the Strengthening Organic Enforcement Rule. The primary purpose is to expand the types of businesses that are required to be certified, to make sure there's more transparency and oversight throughout the supply chain. So currently under the regulations, there is an exception for businesses that might sell or trade organic products, but aren't taking physical ownership of the product. So those companies like brokers and traders currently are not required to be certified. And that was a main challenge and problem that created the fraud opportunity in the past. So this proposed rule will require brokers, traders, importers, and exporters to be certified regardless if they're not taking physical possession of the product. This is going to be a big impact. There's estimated 2,000 operations worldwide that are acting in this capacity that will need to become certified. The rule will also require electronic import certificates. So every shipment of organic products entering the US is going to be required to have an electronic import certificate tracking its country of origin, its quantity, and organic documentation associated with it, and have that information submitted to the Customs and Border Protection. Right now, import certificates are only required for certain countries that have negotiated this documentation as a part of the equivalency arrangements between the US and their governing body. So this Strengthening Organic Enforcement Rule will make that a universal requirement. It's going to mean that there's more oversight, documentation, and audit trail transparency. It'll also mean that we're going to get a lot more data on what exactly is being imported, how much, and from where. The rule will also require every operation to have a fraud prevention plan and to come up with some practices on their operation that will monitor and prevent and detect organic fraud. So some examples of the types of practices that might be involved are looking at your organic system plan and identifying where the critical fraud opportunities might be, seeing where your vulnerabilities might be, and then implementing measures that will address and minimize any risks that might be apparent. And so this is something where, it's going to be very, these practices are going to need to be adapted to your particular operation based on size, scale, and complexity. The rule is also going to require that certifiers conduct supply chain audits annually for all high-risk operations. It also means that inspectors during on-site audits are going to be required to conduct mass balance audits and traceback audits. Now, this is something that might seem intuitive and already a requirement. And unfortunately, these requirements for inspectors to be conducting mass balance audits weren't being enforced as robust as they should have been. And we did see that in previous cases of fraud. So this rule is going to be very explicit in directly requiring inspectors to do mass balance audits and traceback audits at every inspection for all high-risk products.
Hey, Joe, there was a question that came in the chat about certification kind of capacity to take on these tasks. What's your sense of that? Is there enough certification oversight currently, or does that need to be ramped up as well?
That's a great question, and it's definitely going to need to be ramped up. This was a part of the proposed rule comment process. Certifiers had the opportunity to weigh in on what it's going to take for certifiers to not just ramp up their capacity to take on additional certified operations within the current dynamics of the pandemic and already having a backlog of on-site inspections that they're going to need to catch up on. And the rule also requires increased qualifications for inspectors and certification staff. So this is really putting a lot on certifiers to ramp up their procedures, their documentation, and their staff qualifications. Part of the way that we can help certifiers to meet this new need is through the NOP has started a human capital initiative where they're putting a lot of funding behind the inspector and certifier reviewer professional pipeline, making sure that there's enough qualified individuals ready to take on the task. And then also looking at the implementation timeframes and, are all of these requirements going to need to be implemented, all within 1 year from publication of the final rule, or are there parts that may need an additional year of implementation? So this is all very much on the minds of certifiers, and there is some support from the NOP through some additional funding initiatives.
Awesome, thank you for that. Another question came in about if there is any effort that you know of or any momentum behind a kind of country of origin labeling. So like organic grown in the USA versus, grown in the EU, et cetera.
There isn't within the organic regulations. So that would need to come from other USDA regulations like the country of origin labeling. I know there's some parallel work going on there. So, but it would be outside the scope of the NOP regulations.
And in that new pool of transition funding, is there money for to kind of ramp up that enforcement or to help some of those accredited certifying agencies staff up, or is that kind of like, does that not cross the boundary into that?
Well, that's interesting. The USDA is actively developing the program right now, and any ideas that will remove barriers to farmers transitioning to organic and being successful staying in organic are fair game. So I think it's worth putting ideas on the table that would not only support from the farmer perspective, accessing the resources, tools, capital, land, technical assistance, risk management, all of those things, but then also making sure that there's a certifier there ready to act with all of the appropriate services and resources to help, a transitioning operation plus currently certified organic operations that need to maintain organic status or expand.
Awesome, thank you. Sounds like a great time for those among us with the bandwidth to get out your dust off your typewriters and write to your members of Congress or get involved if you have ideas to put in the queue.
Absolutely. What would make it easier for you and your neighbors to transition to organic? And if you put it in the chat, I will make sure it gets into OTA's pipeline as well.
Awesome.
So another part of the strengthening organic enforcement rule is the requirements for data reporting. So operations and certifiers will need to be reporting more data to the organic integrity database. And this is a way to get more transparency on acreage, livestock details, and it's going to help inspectors and certifiers do mass balances and sort of understand whether or not product coming from a particular region is matching up with sales from that particular region. And again, identify any risks of fraud. And then I already mentioned the rule will raise the bar for inspector and certifier qualifications. So there's going to be minimum requirements for knowledge, skills, and experience for inspectors and certifiers, as well as specifics for the scope and scale of operations assigned, so that we're very sure that certifiers and inspectors working on large, complex operations have the unique skills needed to appropriately assess compliance. And there's a lot more, which I'd be happy to go into a little bit more detail if there's time, but there's other parts of the regulation that are going to be important. I will talk a little bit about what are going to be the impacts to U.S. farmers. So we've talked a little bit about all of the new requirements that certifiers are going to need as part of their systems, but what might it mean for currently certified organic farmers here in the U.S.? So the rule is going to have some additional requirements for you in terms of the time and resources needed to implement these new requirements. Now, the NOP is saying that their estimated cost is going to be less than 1% of your total gross revenue, but it's going to really depend on the size and complexity of your operation. And for operations that already have, really strong audit trail documentation, you're already doing really good at verifying and identifying organic within your operation. Say if you have a split operation, if you already have really good systems for identifying organic and doing your commingling and contamination prevention, then you're going to be really well positioned to comply already with any new provisions coming out of this regulation, because what this is meant to do is really make sure that there's clear, consistent requirements for the basic audit trail and organic identification, so that there's no excuses for lax or less rigorous compliance assessments. You might also see some more rigorous on-site inspections, because inspectors are going to need to be really trained up and doing those mass balances at every inspection. So if you're already ready for your inspector with all of your documentation and good systems, you're going to be really well positioned for compliance. And then the benefits of the rule is that there's going to be stronger consumer trust in organic, which means stronger markets, and there's going to be less organic fraud. And so we all need the organic seal to remain strong in order to garner that market premium. Okay, so other regulatory activities at NOP. We've got a couple of livestock regulations that have been a long time coming and are hoping to see some final regulations happening in the spring. So the origin of livestock rule this is the one that's going to clarify and narrow the transition of conventional dairy animals to organic. And there have been 3 comment periods on the proposed rule that was published in 2015. And now the NOP is estimating that the final rule will finally be published in the spring of 2022. And the Organic Livestock and Poultry Practices Rule, which is critical for strengthening the animal welfare requirements and clarifying poultry outdoor access. This is a rule that USDA withdrew in 2018, which was promptly met by several lawsuits, one from OTA. The NOP has now committed that they're revisiting the rulemaking, and they expect to publish a rule in the spring of 2022. Okay, now at the National Organic Standards Board, this is the volunteer citizen advisory board that advises the USDA on materials allowed in organic production and also other aspects of implementing the Organic Foods Production Act. The board meets twice a year in the fall and the spring. And in the most recent fall NOSB meeting, the highlight was a recommendation to prohibit ammonia extracts. So this is in response to a petition that sought to prohibit non-synthetic fertilizers that were made from capturing the ammonia from animal manure, resulting in a purified high ammonia liquid fertilizer. And the National Organic Standards Board reviewed the petition along with public comments and technical information and determined that these purified high nitrogen liquid fertilizers are not compatible with organic principles because they're providing plant available nitrogen in a way that moves the regulations farther away from the principles of organic, in which the basis of plant health is in healthy soil systems. The other highlight is the National Organic Standards Board developed a letter on climate change that they are going to deliver to the USDA, requesting that organic be more featured as a solution in the USDA's efforts to support climate smart agriculture. And now looking to the spring 2022 meeting, we're expecting to see proposals for the spring meeting come out in early March, and we're expecting the board to continue its conversation on high nitrogen fertilizers. There's a proposal that we're expecting to see that's going to set a restriction across the board on all high nitrogen plant available fertilizers. So they're looking at anything that has a carbon to nitrogen ratio of 3:1 or less, and limiting those fertilizers to no more than 20% of the crop's total nitrogen need. The board is also going to be looking at supply chain traceability and ways for technology to support operations and certifiers in identifying and tracking business-to-business transactions along the supply chain. And this is an effort to support supply chain transparency and compliance with the forthcoming strengthening organic enforcement rule. There's also going to be another round of sunset reviews. So every year, the NOSB takes another look at materials on the national list of allowed materials and reevaluates if they should continue to be allowed. So things like herbicidal soaps, elemental sulfur, copper, micronutrients, these are things that might be, a staple of your toolbox on fertility or pest control or sanitizers, and they're going to be up for re-review. And it's always important to participate in this public process if these materials remain important for your organic system. Okay, I'm going to hop to just a couple of other industry priorities, and then we'll use the remaining time for any other questions. So I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about all the work that individual companies in the private sector have been doing to tackle the challenge of fraud. And so the Organic Trade Association started this Organic Fraud Prevention Solutions program. We got it right underway in the wake of the 2017 fraud cases, recognizing that, yes, we needed stronger legislation and stronger organic regulations, but also there are things that organic businesses can be doing right now to train up and improve their own internal staff and systems on ways to detect and prevent fraud, and then also help businesses communicate with each other to ensure buyer responsibility is passed on throughout the value chain. So this is a program, it's voluntary, of course, and it helps NOP certified organic businesses develop an organic fraud prevention plan. It focuses on preventive approaches, on reducing the fraud opportunity. It provides a lot of training and resources to help businesses do their own vulnerability assessments and implement mitigation measures. It gets those fraud prevention plans in place and then has them reviewed by third-party qualified experts. And then once approved, those fraud prevention plans become a part of your organic system plan, just like what you submit to your certifier every year. And the certifier is then responsible for reviewing and approving any updates to your organic system plan, which would include your fraud prevention plan. So in this way, the program just nests right into your existing process of communicating with your certifier all of the ways that you are demonstrating compliance with the organic standards, including fraud prevention. A lot of these trainings that we have put together for the program are free and are available to you right now if you'd like to dive in and learn a little bit more about how to develop a fraud prevention plan. One of the trainings is available through the Food Fraud Prevention Academy, and 2 other trainings are available on the NOP Organic Learning Center. And so you can check those out for free. We are also very excited to support the Organic Agronomy Training Service as a way to boost the accessibility of organic technical assistance to organic producers. And the Organic Trade Association is the fiscal sponsor of this program. We have pooled industry funds to support the program, and I think it's a great way to show support for this public good by pooling the industry funds. And if you haven't yet listened to the Oats podcast, what are you waiting for? It's a great listen. There are 6 episodes that tackle the most common criticisms through expert interviews and real world examples about organic. So do check out the Dirt on Organic Farming podcast. And I believe this is the last initiative I'll talk about, which is new legislation called the Continuous Improvement and Accountability in Organic Standards Act. This legislation was introduced earlier this year by a bipartisan group of members of Congress, and it's meant to address this tremendous backlog of National Organic Standards Board recommendations that have never been implemented by the USDA. So we have tracked that in the last decade, there have been 20 recommendations from the NOSB for improving the organic standards, and the USDA has not completed rulemaking on any of them. And I've listed here on this slide just a couple of the oldest ones. And overall, this inaction on behalf of USDA is stifling innovation. It has led to market failure in some cases. It's preventing certain segments of the organic industry from developing or advancing. And it's creating consumer confusion around elements of the organic standards and what the USDA seal is meant to represent. So this legislation is meant to require USDA to clear the backlog of NOSB recommendations by issuing an action plan on how they're going to go about addressing all of them and making that plan available for public to comment on to identify their priorities. The legislation also sets a new framework for the future so that any new recommendations coming out of the NOSB are set on an affirmative obligation for USDA to enact them in a designated period of time. And there are off-ramps in case USDA chooses not to implement. They've got to be transparent on their reasons so that there's no more black box on what happens to an NOSB recommendation once it leaves the NOSB and goes to USDA. And then thirdly, the bill requires certifiers to implement new recommendations and give NOP updates on how it's going. And the NOP needs to have a keen awareness of how new regulations are being implemented so that any inconsistencies can be caught early and addressed before large deviations happen. And then we've got the whole Farm Bill next. So all of the Farm Bill negotiations are going to start next spring. It's been 30 years since the Organic Foods Production Act was signed into law. And so the Farm Bill is an opportunity to reimagine what organic needs in order to be successful into the future. So we're thinking really deeply about how to position organic for some really strong advancement in the next Farm Bill. And part of our efforts at the Organic Trade Association is hosting a series of workshops to think big across the organic community about ways that organic has worked, has not worked, and how to make improvements through the next Farm Bill to set organic on a better path for the future. Okay, and with that, I will leave you with this long list of resources. The hyperlinks I will maybe share in the chat, or I'll share the whole presentation with the audience, and you'll be able to get access to more industry market data, a webinar on ag statistics. We have a paper on U.S. organic grain and how to keep it growing. Spoiler alert, technical assistance like oats is one of the top recommendations. We've got a lot of detail on the Strengthening Organic Enforcement Rule and a whole summary of what's in there. We've got resources on organic as a climate change solution. We've got a full report on outcomes from the last NOSB meeting, and more information on the continuous improvement legislation and that whole list of 20+ NOSB recommendations hanging out in that backlog that we need to get cleared. And my contact information for any follow-up, I welcome it. And thank you all so much for your time and listening. And I hope I've saved at least a few minutes for some more questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much, Joe, for taking the time to present to us and putting all the work in and putting the presentation together. We really appreciate it. I, for one, I mean, just a lot of great information there, but I personally feel pretty hopeful about all the movement on kind of the USDA front about strengthening the label. I also get that sense too that this is really something where the organic industry itself is clamoring for more regulation. What industry is taking that step, like in the marketplace? Like, please regulate us more. But I mean, at the end of the day, if consumers have less confidence in the label, that impacts everyone from food companies all the way down to us as a seed company. So I mean, it's definitely I look at those programs being rolled out, and I feel a lot of hope for the direction that we're moving, and that, you know, the USDA is responding to concerns that have rightly responded to concerns that have been raised in the organic community. So I think that's my 2-cent editorial. So we have a couple minutes here, so would encourage you to ask questions in the chat if you have them. I know it was a lot of great information to consider and ponder, but we do have a few minutes here if folks want to chime in. All right. Well, seeing none, thank you again. Oh, here we go. Here's one. a couple actually. So a question about the sense of the timing about when the embargo on Indian soy meal might be lifted. Seems like there's kind of multiple entanglements there, but maybe you could comment a little bit about that.
So the investigation on the anti-dumping, let me scroll up here to my detailed notes. I do have a timeline. Okay, so the investigation into the anti-dumping and the countervailing trade case. The final determination is going to be made next March, so March of 2022. I can share some more details on that timeline. I believe there are a few milestones in between now and then where affected entities in the US will have an opportunity to provide information. So I'll share some more details on that particular item, but by March, the ITC and commerce investigations should be concluded.
Great, that's helpful. There's another comment in the chat about, you know, if larger entities in the organic marketplace are for regulation, what's kind of been in your mind, what's been the holdup to kind of strengthening the label and getting some of those tighter, kind of closing the doors, so to speak, on either domestic fraud or you know, international fraud?
Well, there's a lot of consensus from the organic community on stronger regulations, like the strengthening organic enforcement rule. You know, we want to make sure that it's implemented in a way that, you know, still highlights and elevates and maintains the good work that, you know, the compliant, legitimate organic operations are already doing. In other cases, like with the full backlog of NOSB recommendations, it's really unfortunate because many of those recommendations, like the origin of livestock rule and the organic livestock and poultry practices rule, there is huge consensus across the organic community that we want to see those regulations move forward. So the holdup is not from within the organic community. It's a lot of political entanglements and pressure from the conventional side of things. So it's a challenge, I think, that's brought on by organic's own success. And we just need to make it known that organic practices, organic businesses, and all of the benefits that come from organic farming are worth it, and that everyone needs to go organic, and conventional really needs to be thinking of organic as a true solution and think about transition. So there's a long way to go. I think this is an opportunity within the current USDA to get a lot more support and resources for the great work that organic farmers are already doing.
Yeah, totally. And another call out too to those folks that are so inclined to get involved and to contact your Congress people. And I only had a short experience with doing some lobbying last year, and it was surprising how much legislators from ag states are aware of organic and are fairly responsive to those concerns. So it's definitely, if you have the bandwidth to send a letter or to get involved, it's definitely worth the while. Cool. Well, again, thank you, Joe, for being a part of this. We really appreciate it. So right now, we're going to pause for